It is March 1603, Richmond Palace. The most powerful woman in the world is dying on the floor. For days, Queen Elizabeth I of England had refused to lie down. Attendants placed cushions around her. Her ladies begged her to move. She wouldn't. She stood, then sat, then collapsed onto the cushions, but she would not go to bed. Because somewhere in the collapsed architecture of her mind, she believed that the moment she lay down, she would never get up. The Privy Council, the most powerful men in England, was in open panic outside her door. England had no declared heir. The Queen had no husband, no children, no successor named in any document. And the woman who had ruled for 45 years was staring at the ceiling of Richmond Palace, silent, refusing medicine, refusing food, refusing her physician's hands. Then she gave her final order. Not about succession, not about James of Scotland. The last command Elizabeth I issued as Queen of England was personal, absolute, and so strange that her own counselors didn't know what to do with it. No physician was to touch her body after death, no examination, no autopsy, no embalming by royal doctors. Her body would be sealed quickly and the reason would die with her. That order is the most documented and least explained moment of her death. And what it reveals about Elizabeth I, about what she was hiding and what she was afraid of, is far darker than the legend ever admitted. To understand why that order was shocking, you need to understand what it replaced. When a Tudor monarch died, the body did not simply disappear into a coffin. There was a process, a protocol centuries in the making, and it served purposes that were simultaneously medical, political, and deeply symbolic. The royal physicians entered first. They performed what the period called an opening, a systematic examination and evisceration of the body. Organs were removed, inspected, and separately interred. The cavity was packed with preserving agents, aromatic herbs, salt, and various compounds that slowed decomposition. The body was then wrapped, embalmed, and prepared for lying in state. This wasn't a formality. It was constitutional theater. A dead monarch had to be seen to be dead. England had been through enough disputed successions, enough rumors of secret survival and hidden kings, that the public viewing of a royal corpse served a function modern democracies handle with election certificates. The body was proof. The body was evidence. The body was the state completing its transfer. Henry VIII had gone through this process. So had Edward II, so had Mary B. Even the monarchs who died suddenly, even the ones whose deaths were politically complicated, were opened, examined, and displayed. Elizabeth refused it all. She refused it while she was still alive, which was itself remarkable. She issued the prohibition before her death, in the final coherent communications her counselors received from her. The instruction was unambiguous. Her ladies would prepare the body. No physician, no opening, no examination. Robert Cecil, her chief minister, received this information and appears to have simply accepted it. There is no record of serious pushback, no formal objection lodged in the state papers, which tells you something about the court's relationship with the queen they served. Even dying on a floor, she could still issue a command that silenced a room full of powerful men. But why? The answer requires you to understand something that Tudor biography tends to gloss over in its rush toward the romance and the politics. Elizabeth's body by 1603 was not the body of the legend. The woman who had sat for portraits that showed luminous skin and perfect composure was, in her 70s, physically deteriorating in ways her court went to extraordinary lengths to conceal. Her teeth had rotted to near absence over the preceding decades. Contemporary accounts, including those of the French ambassador, described gaps, blackening, and a visible difficulty speaking that she compensated for with deliberate vocal technique. She wore heavy wigs over hair that had thinned dramatically. Her face required layers of cosmetics, the famous white lead foundation, applied so thickly that foreign dignitaries reported she looked like a painted mask. None of this was secret in the sense of being unknown. People in her court were aware. Foreign diplomats mentioned it in dispatched letters. But there is a difference between whispered awareness and documented medical record. An autopsy would have produced a documented medical record. Royal physicians who performed examinations wrote reports. Those reports entered the archive. They could be read by historians, by foreign courts, by political enemies, by anyone who gained access to state papers. An examination of Elizabeth's body in 1603 would have produced, in permanent written form, a clinical accounting of what the Queen of England actually looked like without the wig, without the makeup, without the careful performance she had sustained for 4 decades. And it would have documented something potentially more significant than rotted teeth or thinning hair. Elizabeth had spent 45 years ruling as a brand. The Virgin Queen. Untouched, unbroken, belonging to no man and therefore belonging entirely to England. This was not just a personal identity, it was the ideological foundation of her entire reign. She had refused marriage proposals from half the crowned heads of Europe and turned each refusal into a political tool. She had managed Parliament's demands for a successor by keeping everyone convinced she might still produce an heir, even into her 50s and 60s, when the possibility had long since become biological fiction. The Virgin Queen was a political construction that required, above all else, never being clinically examined. A royal physician opening the body of Elizabeth II would have been required professionally to document what he found. Whether she had borne children, whether she had evidence of disease, whether the biological reality of her body matched the political mythology she had spent a lifetime building. Whatever he found or didn't find would have existed in writing permanently in the hands of a new king who was already arriving from Scotland and who had every reason to understand exactly what he was inheriting. Certain anatomical details regarding the Queen's physical state are too visceral for public broadcast. The original clinical reports from 1603 contain biological descriptions that modern platform guidelines do not permit. We have preserved these unredacted primary sources in the Tudor Enigma, a technical dossier for those who demand the unfiltered truth. The private archive is now accessible through the first link in the description and the pinned comment. Elizabeth understood this. She was not, despite the soft focus portraits, a sentimental woman. She was a precise one, and the most precise thing she did in her final weeks was draw a line around her body that no physician was permitted to cross. But there was a third reason, one that sits underneath the vanity and the political calculation. And it is the one historians discuss least often. Elizabeth was afraid of profanation. This requires context. Royal bodies in the early modern period were not simply bodies. They carried a theological weight that the secular modern mind finds difficult to reconstruct. The monarch's physical form was understood to be touched by divine appointment. Not metaphorically, not poetically, but in a real sense that affected how courts, churches, and common people related to royal remains. Allowing physicians to cut open that body was not merely a medical procedure. It was, in the imagination of the period, a form of violation. The instruments entering the flesh of an anointed queen. The organs removed and placed in separate containers. The interior of the body examined by eyes that were not supposed to see it. Elizabeth had watched what happened to bodies that were profaned. She knew what had been done to her mother. Anne Boleyn had been beheaded, buried without ceremony in an arrow chest, her memory systematically erased. Elizabeth had lived her entire life in the shadow of a mother whose body had been treated as refuse. The psychological residue of that knowledge is incalculable, but it was there. More immediately, she had seen what was done to Mary, Queen of Scots, after the execution at Fotheringhay in 1587. Mary's body had been opened, embalmed, wrapped, and kept for months before burial. Her possessions were searched. Her papers were seized. Her physical remains became the property of the English state that had killed her. The woman vanished into the machinery of official documentation. Elizabeth had ordered that execution. She had lived with it for 16 years, and in the clarity of her final weeks, she appears to have understood that dying was its own form of surrender. That the moment she stopped breathing, her body would stop being hers. The physicians would come. The instruments would come. The reports would be written, unless she forbade it. The order she issued was, in this reading, not just about concealment. It was a last act of sovereignty. Control over her own body in the only moment she could still exercise it. The political machinery could have the throne. James could have England. But the interior of her body, whatever it contained, whatever it revealed, whatever it would have told the world, belonged to no one but her. What happened next is where the story becomes genuinely macabre. Elizabeth died on March 24, 1603, sometime in the early morning hours. Her ladies prepared the body according to the Queen's instruction, without physicians, without the standard procedure. The body was wrapped and placed in a coffin. A lead coffin, soldered shut. The decision to use a lead-lined coffin was not unusual for royalty. Lead was a standard component of royal burial preparation. But the speed of the sealing and the absence of proper embalming created a problem that Elizabeth, in her careful final calculation, had apparently not fully accounted for, or had accounted for and considered acceptable. The body was kept at Richmond for several weeks before the formal funeral procession to Westminster. And in that time, in the sealed lead coffin, in the spring warmth, the unpreserved body began to decompose. Lady Anne Southwell, one of Elizabeth's court ladies, left an account of what happened that has been cited and disputed for 4 centuries. She writes that the coffin burst, that the gases of decomposition had built to a pressure the lead could not contain, that attendants who were present described the sound and the aftermath. Whether this account is literal, embellished, or metaphorical is a question historians continue to debate. But the details circulated in court documents of the period. It was not invented later. And what it suggests, if even partially true, is that Elizabeth's final act of bodily control had produced a physical consequence that was, in its own way, more revealing than any autopsy would have been. She had tried to keep the body intact and secret. The body refused. The coffin was eventually moved to Westminster Abbey, placed near her sister Mary Lasher in the north aisle of Henry VII's Lady Chapel, where it remains. No examination of the remains has ever been conducted with modern forensic methods. The prohibition Elizabeth issued in 1603 has never been formally revisited. Whatever is in that coffin, whatever the physicians would have found, whatever the documents would have recorded, is still there. Sealed, undocumented, exactly as she intended. History is full of powerful people who tried to control their own narratives. Most of them failed. The archives opened, the letters surfaced, the witnesses talked. Elizabeth failed too, eventually. We know about the rotted teeth, the wigs, the white lead makeup. We know the Virgin Queen mythology was constructed and maintained with considerable effort and the willing participation of an entire court. We know that the body beneath the portraits did not match the portraits, but we don't know what her physicians would have written. That is the one document that doesn't exist, the one record that her final order successfully prevented, and it sits in the center of her death like a locked room in a palace full of open doors. The 300 Spartans get statues because the sacrifice is legible. The story fits in a sentence. What Elizabeth did at Richmond in 1603 is harder to compress. It was a dying woman issuing a command that was simultaneously about vanity, politics, theology, and something that might be closest to pure, terrified privacy. She had spent 45 years allowing England to look at her. The one thing she refused them was a look at the truth. And because she refused it, the question is still open. What was she hiding? What would the physicians have found? What did she know about her own body that she was willing to die without telling anyone? She never said. She sealed the coffin, and she took the answer with her. If this is the kind of history you want, the parts they locked away, the questions that never got answered, subscribe and hit the bell. Every few days we go into the rooms history forgot to open. You don't want to miss what's next.